Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the story. It was a chilly, rainy evening in New York City when Mark Davis, a struggling student, received a phone call that would change his life forever. He had been living paycheck to paycheck, juggling his final year of law school and a part-time job. The weight of his late father's debts hung over him like a storm cloud. He stepped into the small bistro, his shoes squeaking slightly as he walked to the corner table. He had hoped to enjoy a quiet evening, but fate had other plans. When the woman he was supposed to meet, Eleanor Brooks, an elegant and wealthy older woman, greeted him with an unexpected proposition, he was left speechless. "Marry me," she said, as cool and calm as if discussing the weather. "Think of it as a business arrangement. I'll pay off your debts and secure your financial future." Mark blinked, unable to grasp the gravity of what she was asking. He stammered, "Excuse me?" Eleanor, unfazed, leaned forward slightly and explained in precise, controlled tones, "I need a husband to maintain control of my legacy. I have no family left, and you're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this offer." Mark felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Was this a joke? No, it couldn't be. He could barely make ends meet, let alone refuse an offer like this. But the thought of marrying a woman he barely knew just for money was too much for him to process. Eleanor's eyes were steady, watching him intently as she added, "Don't take too long to think about it. The offer doesn't stand forever." Her words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Mark didn't have to think for long. His family's debts were suffocating him. He didn't have many options left. The promise of financial stability was tempting, but something about this felt wrong. Still, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming pressure to save his family from ruin. He nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said, almost in a whisper. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile as she nodded in approval. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." A week later, Mark stood in a courthouse, the reality of his decision settling in. The ceremony was quick, witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. It was an impersonal affair, no flowers, no family, just a contract that would change the course of both their lives. As they exchanged vows, Mark felt a strange mix of relief and unease. This wasn't the life he had imagined. This wasn't love. It was business. After the ceremony, Eleanor led him to her mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. It was a place that exuded old money, towering columns, pristine stone facades, and gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. As Mark stepped out of the car, he couldn't help but feel like he was walking into someone else's dream. It wasn't his world. He wasn't sure he belonged there. Eleanor greeted him with her usual poise, her voice smooth and authoritative. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." The words felt foreign in his mouth. His life, the one he had known, was slipping away with every step he took inside her mansion. The grand staircase loomed ahead, and with it, the beginning of a life he never expected. The next few days were a whirlwind. Eleanor had arranged a complete makeover for him, tailored suits, lavish dinners, and even lessons on how to behave in high society. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a role in someone else's story, but he went along with it, knowing he had no other choice. Yet, as the days went by, he began to notice something unexpected. Despite the coldness of their arrangement, Eleanor treated him with an odd sense of respect. She didn't see him as just a pawn in her game. There was something in her eyes that Mark couldn't quite see, a flicker of something more. He wasn't sure what it was, but it made him feel less like a mere contract and more like a person. The boundaries of their arrangement began to blur, and Mark found himself wondering if he had made the right choice. What started as a simple business deal was becoming something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the story. It was a chilly, rainy evening in New York City when Mark Davis, a struggling student, received a phone call that would change his life forever. He had been living paycheck to paycheck, juggling his final year of law school and a part-time job. The weight of his late father's debts hung over him like a storm cloud. He stepped into the small bistro, his shoes squeaking slightly as he walked to the corner table. He had hoped to enjoy a quiet evening, but fate had other plans. When the woman he was supposed to meet, Eleanor Brooks, an elegant and wealthy older woman, greeted him with an unexpected proposition, he was left speechless. "Marry me," she said, as cool and calm as if discussing the weather. "Think of it as a business arrangement. I'll pay off your debts and secure your financial future." Mark blinked, unable to grasp the gravity of what she was asking. He stammered, "Excuse me?" Eleanor, unfazed, leaned forward slightly and explained in precise, controlled tones, "I need a husband to maintain control of my legacy. I have no family left, and you're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this offer." Mark felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Was this a joke? No, it couldn't be. He could barely make ends meet, let alone refuse an offer like this. But the thought of marrying a woman he barely knew just for money was too much for him to process. Eleanor's eyes were steady, watching him intently as she added, "Don't take too long to think about it. The offer doesn't stand forever." Her words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Mark didn't have to think for long. His family's debts were suffocating him. He didn't have many options left. The promise of financial stability was tempting, but something about this felt wrong. Still, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming pressure to save his family from ruin. He nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said, almost in a whisper. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile as she nodded in approval. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." A week later, Mark stood in a courthouse, the reality of his decision settling in. The ceremony was quick, witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. It was an impersonal affair, no flowers, no family, just a contract that would change the course of both their lives. As they exchanged vows, Mark felt a strange mix of relief and unease. This wasn't the life he had imagined. This wasn't love. It was business. After the ceremony, Eleanor led him to her mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. It was a place that exuded old money, towering columns, pristine stone facades, and gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. As Mark stepped out of the car, he couldn't help but feel like he was walking into someone else's dream. It wasn't his world. He wasn't sure he belonged there. Eleanor greeted him with her usual poise, her voice smooth and authoritative. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." The words felt foreign in his mouth. His life, the one he had known, was slipping away with every step he took inside her mansion. The grand staircase loomed ahead, and with it, the beginning of a life he never expected. The next few days were a whirlwind. Eleanor had arranged a complete makeover for him, tailored suits, lavish dinners, and even lessons on how to behave in high society. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a role in someone else's story, but he went along with it, knowing he had no other choice. Yet, as the days went by, he began to notice something unexpected. Despite the coldness of their arrangement, Eleanor treated him with an odd sense of respect. She didn't see him as just a pawn in her game. There was something in her eyes that Mark couldn't quite see, a flicker of something more. He wasn't sure what it was, but it made him feel less like a mere contract and more like a person. The boundaries of their arrangement began to blur, and Mark found himself wondering if he had made the right choice. What started as a simple business deal was becoming something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Mark spent the following days in a blur of luxury and unfamiliarity. Eleanor had arranged a complete makeover for him, tailored suits, new shoes, and even a crash course on how to behave in high society. The once simple and practical man who had worried about rent and bills now stood in the grand halls of a mansion, surrounded by opulence he could never have imagined. But despite the wealth surrounding him, something inside him still felt out of place. Eleanor, calm and composed as always, had put him in this new world, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. He caught glimpses of himself in mirrors and windows, his reflection now polished and sharp in the new suit, but still, the weight of the past clung to him. He knew his life had changed, but it didn't feel like the kind of change that made him happy. It was like stepping into someone else's life, a life that didn't feel like his own. Eleanor had been kind, professional, and detached, treating their arrangement with an almost clinical precision. But lately, Mark had started noticing something different. There was a subtle shift in her behavior, a softness in her eyes, a hint of warmth in her words. She wasn't just the businesswoman he had expected her to be. There were moments when she would smile at him, a genuine smile that made him feel less like a contract and more like a person. But Mark couldn't allow himself to think too much about it. He had entered into this arrangement for one reason: money. And that was the only thing that mattered. He had to remind himself of that every day. His family depended on him, and there was no room for weakness, no room for distraction. But as the days passed, he began to question everything. Eleanor had insisted they keep their relationship strictly business, but there were moments when the lines began to blur. He found himself wanting to know more about her, what motivated her, why she was so determined to keep things professional. What was she hiding behind that calm, composed facade? The more he tried to ignore it, the more he realized that he couldn't. There was something about her that drew him in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she, too, was hiding something. Mark had always been a man who faced challenges head-on. He had to, given the circumstances. But now, as he walked through the grand halls of Eleanor's mansion, he found himself grappling with a new challenge. The challenge wasn't financial, though that was a relief; it was emotional. He had signed up for this life, but he hadn't expected to care about the woman behind the contract. He hadn't expected to find himself thinking about her when he should be focused on his family's future. He hadn't expected to be questioning everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. As Eleanor's lawyer prepared the final documents for their arrangement, Mark sat in her study, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The papers were ready. The deal was done. It was all set in stone. But something inside him made him hesitate. The finality of it all was too much for him to ignore. He glanced up at Eleanor, who stood by the window, looking out over the vast estate. Her back was straight, her posture perfect, but for the first time, Mark noticed the faint tension in her shoulders. She wasn't as composed as she appeared. There was a vulnerability there, one that she kept hidden behind her carefully curated exterior. It made Mark wonder about the woman he was really dealing with. Was she just a businesswoman who had no interest in love, or was there more to her story than he had imagined? The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them knew how to break it. Eleanor, ever the professional, turned away from the window and looked at Mark. She didn't smile this time. Her expression was serious, almost unreadable. "This is the last step," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. Mark nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. "I know," he said, his voice low. He couldn't tell if he was ready for this next step, whether he was ready to sign away his life, his future, to a woman he hardly knew. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It couldn't be. Something had changed in him, and he wasn't sure what it meant. But as he sat there, facing Eleanor, he realized that he had no choice but to move forward. He had already committed to this life, and now, he would have to see it through. The deal had been made. The papers were signed. And yet, for the first time, Mark found himself wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Mark had never imagined his life would take such a turn. Just a few weeks ago, he was a law student scraping by, barely able to pay rent. Now, he found himself living in a mansion, wearing suits that cost more than his entire monthly salary, and attending extravagant events he never could have imagined in his wildest dreams. But despite the wealth, despite the luxurious surroundings, something inside him still felt empty. The agreement was clear: marry Eleanor for a year, help her maintain control of her estate, and in return, he would be free of the financial burden that had weighed him down for so long. It was a deal that made sense, at least on paper. Yet, as the days passed, Mark couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he was living a life that wasn't truly his. The mansion felt cold even though it was full of expensive furnishings and grandiose rooms. The servants were respectful but distant, and Eleanor, despite her kindness, seemed to be a woman with walls built high around her heart. He had never asked for this kind of life. It was all so overwhelming. He had expected it to be easier, just sign the papers, play the part of the husband, and get the money. But as time went on, Mark started to realize that things weren't so simple. He had underestimated the emotional toll of this arrangement. Eleanor, too, seemed to struggle with their situation. She was always composed, always in control, but there were moments when Mark caught glimpses of something else, something that made him wonder if she, too, was questioning everything. One night, they found themselves alone at a gala. The ballroom was full of guests, but the noise and chatter faded as Mark and Eleanor stood in a quiet corner, away from the crowd. Eleanor was wearing a stunning silver dress, her hair elegantly swept back, but the way she held herself seemed different. There was a slight stiffness in her posture, and her eyes, though calm, were distant. Mark couldn't help but notice the subtle vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. He had never seen her like this before, and it made him feel something he wasn't ready for: concern. He had always seen Eleanor as a strong, independent woman. But now, he saw the cracks in her armor, and they unsettled him. "You know," Mark said, breaking the silence, "you don't have to keep up this act." Eleanor turned to him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice still composed. "You don't have to pretend to be perfect," Mark said quietly, his words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm not perfect either. We don't have to keep pretending for everyone else." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She looked at him, studying his face as if weighing his words. Mark's heart raced, unsure if he had overstepped. He had never intended to challenge her so directly. But for some reason, it felt like the right thing to say. After a long pause, Eleanor took a deep breath. "I know," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of emotion. "I just don't know how to stop." Mark looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not the polished, untouchable Eleanor Brooks, but the woman behind the facade. There was something broken in her, something that reminded him of himself. They were both here, stuck in an arrangement that neither of them had wanted, yet neither of them knew how to get out of. The realization hit him hard. Eleanor had built her life around control, around being the strong, untouchable woman who didn't need anyone. But deep down, Mark could see that she, too, was lonely, just as lonely as he was. "Maybe we don't have to stop," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we just need to find a way to be real." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of hope in them. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Maybe," she replied. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mark and Eleanor shared a quiet, unspoken connection that neither of them had expected. The walls that had kept them apart seemed to shrink just a little, and for the first time, they both realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this arrangement than they had originally thought. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the beginning of something. As the night ended and they returned to the mansion, Mark couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Was it possible that their arrangement, once built on the foundation of a contract, could evolve into something real? Could they ever truly be honest with each other, or were they forever bound by the rules they had set? Mark wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer the same man who had walked into this mansion just a few weeks ago. Something had changed. And he couldn't go back. As the days passed, the subtle shift between Mark and Eleanor continued to grow. Their arrangement, once a cold and calculated contract, had slowly begun to change, but neither of them knew where it would lead. Mark still couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life, but now, something about the mansion and its opulence seemed less foreign. Eleanor had stopped keeping her distance quite so much. They spent more time together at dinner, at the charity events she hosted, and even on quiet nights in the mansion. It was clear that, despite their agreement, both of them were beginning to question the nature of their relationship. Eleanor's professional demeanor was still intact, but there were moments when Mark saw a glimpse of the woman behind it all. She had always been composed, always in control, but he started to notice the cracks in her armor. She would let her guard down when they were alone, smiling more freely, laughing at his jokes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Mark wonder if they were finally beginning to build something real. One evening, after a particularly stressful day filled with meetings and negotiations, Eleanor invited Mark to the garden behind the mansion. The night was cool, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver glow on the lush greenery. They walked side by side, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. "I never imagined this would be my life," Eleanor said softly, breaking the silence. Mark glanced over at her, surprised. She had always been so focused on business, on maintaining control, that it was rare to hear her speak so personally. "What do you mean?" he asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I was doing the right thing." But now her voice trailed off as she looked up at the stars. "Now, I'm not so sure." Mark felt a surge of sympathy for her. He had known from the beginning that their arrangement was meant to be temporary, a business deal, nothing more. But now, as he walked beside Eleanor, he found himself thinking differently. He hadn't expected to care about her, had agreed to this deal out of necessity, not out of affection. Yet, the more time they spent together, the more he saw how much they both had in common. They were both driven by a need for something more, something real. Eleanor had spent her life building an empire, yet she still felt a deep emptiness. Mark had spent his life struggling to survive, but he, too, had felt the weight of that same emptiness. It was a strange feeling, this connection between them. Neither of them had ever expected it. Neither of them knew how to navigate it, but as they walked through the garden, Mark couldn't help but feel that they were both on the edge of something new. Something they hadn't planned for. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "I never thought I'd end up here. In this life, I mean." Eleanor looked at him, her expression softening. "I never thought I'd end up here either." They stood there in silence for a moment, the cool night air between them. Neither of them knew what would happen next, but there was something unspoken between them. Something that went beyond the terms of their contract, beyond the business arrangement. It was the beginning of something they had both been searching for. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something. As they turned to head back inside, Mark realized that he didn't feel the same sense of detachment he had felt before. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. Something had shifted. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something real. The next few days were a blur of events and gatherings. Eleanor continued to keep her distance when they were in public, but behind closed doors, things had changed. They spoke more openly, shared more about their lives, and even laughed together. Mark found himself looking forward to their time together, something he had never expected when they first signed the contract. One evening, after a gala, they found themselves alone in the study, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. Mark was sitting in an armchair, Eleanor standing by the window, looking out at the city. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice quiet, "if we made the right choice? If this is what we really wanted?" Mark didn't answer right away. He sat for a moment, thinking about her question. He had made a choice. This deal had been his only way out of his debts, his only way to secure a future for his family. But as he looked at Eleanor, standing there in the dim light, he wondered if he had made the right choice for himself. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But maybe it's time to stop thinking about what we wanted and start thinking about what we need." Eleanor turned to face him, a soft smile on her lips. For the first time, Mark saw the woman beneath the businesswoman, the woman who had been hurt and lonely, just like him. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they sat there, in the quiet of the study, something passed between them. A shared understanding, a shared connection. It was subtle, but it was there. And for the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't just living a life that someone else had planned for him. He was living his own life, his and Eleanor's. The journey they had started together, though unconventional, was beginning to feel like the beginning of something real. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor's lives together became more complex. What had started as a business arrangement, a simple contract, was evolving into something neither of them could ignore. Eleanor, ever the composed professional, still maintained the distance that had been the foundation of their relationship. But now, there was something different. There was an undercurrent between them, an unspoken tension that neither of them could deny. Their conversations were deeper now, more personal. They shared things they had never expected to Mark, his struggles with debt and his fear of failure, Eleanor, her loneliness, the weight of running a vast empire alone, and her reluctance to trust anyone, especially a man she had married out of necessity. It was late one evening when everything shifted. After another long day of meetings and event planning, Eleanor had invited Mark to join her in her study. The mansion was quiet, save for the sound of the rain gently tapping against the windows. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Mark had just finished his glass of whiskey when Eleanor stood by the window, her back to him, looking out at the darkened city. There was something different in her posture, that night less regal, more vulnerable. "I never thought I would be here," Eleanor said softly, almost to herself. Mark raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for something she had not yet found. "I've built this empire, Mark," she continued, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I have everything I could ever want, yet here I am, wondering if it was worth it." Mark felt his chest tighten. He had never heard her speak like this. Eleanor, the unshakable businesswoman, the woman who had everything under control, was now standing before him, questioning the very life she had created. "You don't have to answer that," she added quickly, turning her gaze back to the city lights. But Mark couldn't let it go. He stood up and walked over to where she was, his steps silent on the thick carpet. "Maybe you've been asking yourself the wrong question," he said softly, standing beside her. Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Mark wasn't sure what he was doing, but the words came out before he could stop them. "Maybe it's not about whether it was worth it," he said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "Maybe it's about what you want now." The words hung in the air between them. There was a long, lingering silence as Eleanor processed what he had said. She looked at him, and for a moment, Mark saw a flicker of something, hope, in her eyes. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had always been the one in control, the one making decisions, the one in charge. But standing there with Mark, she realized that she was no longer sure of anything. "I don't know what I want anymore," she whispered. The vulnerability in her voice shocked Mark, and for the first time, he saw her as more than just the woman he had agreed to marry for financial reasons. She was a persona woman with doubts, fears, and desires. And suddenly, Mark felt a connection to her he had never expected. He reached out and gently took her hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They stood there, connected in a way they hadn't been before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something more real than anything they had experienced in their brief time together. Slowly, Eleanor turned her hand to hold his. "I don't know what this is," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "But I think I'm starting to feel something for you." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected this, never expected that their arrangement would lead them here. He had entered this marriage with only one goal in mind: to escape his financial troubles. But now, he found himself wanting something more. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he didn't want to go back to the way things were. Slowly, he pulled her into a gentle embrace, their bodies pressed together as they stood in the quiet, dimly lit room. It wasn't a dramatic moment, it wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was enough. It was a moment of realization, a quiet understanding between them that things had changed. And for the first time, both of them realized they weren't just bound by a contract anymore. They were starting to build something real, something they had never expected. As they held each other, the world outside seemed to fade away. The noise of the city, the worries about their arrangement, even the doubts in their own mindset, all seemed distant, unimportant. In that moment, it was just the two of them, together in the stillness. Mark knew that everything had changed. He didn't know where this would go, but he no longer cared. He was no longer living someone else's life. He was finally living his own. The days following that quiet, intimate moment felt different for both Mark and Eleanor. They continued their daily routines, attending meetings, hosting events, and fulfilling the duties of their arrangement, but something had undeniably shifted between them. There was a newfound understanding, a subtle but undeniable connection that neither of them had anticipated. Eleanor, who had always maintained her stoic, control persona, began to open up more. She didn't just smile at Mark out of politeness anymore. There was a warmth in her expression, a genuine kindness that made Mark question everything he had assumed about her. But as much as they had grown closer, there was still a distance, a boundary neither of them could cross easily. The walls they had built around themselves were high, and both were afraid of what would happen if they let them down completely. One evening, after another gala Eleanor had hosted, they found themselves in the garden again, standing beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. The night air was cool, and the soft hum of the city was distant, as if the world outside their bubble had ceased to exist. Eleanor leaned against the stone railing, her arms crossed, looking up at the stars. Mark stood beside her, giving her space but still close enough that they could feel the presence of each other. It had become their ritual, these late-night walks after the chaos of the events, when they could finally talk, uninterrupted. "Do you ever feel like we're living two separate lives?" Eleanor asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost vulnerable in a way that made Mark stop in his tracks. She had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots, but tonight, there was something different about her, something that made her feel more like a real person and less like the businesswoman she had always been. Mark turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I know what you mean," he said softly. "We've been living this arrangement for so long, it's hard to know where the lines blur. But I don't think we're as separate as you think." Eleanor glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're both here, aren't we?" Mark's voice was steady but full of emotion. "We may have started out as strangers with a contract, but I'm starting to believe we've built something more than that. Even if it's messy, even if we don't know where it's going, it's real." The words hummed between them for a moment, neither of them knowing exactly how to react. It was a vulnerable admission, one that Mark hadn't planned to make, but now that he had said it, he realized it was the truth. Eleanor remained silent, her gaze fixed on the stars above them. For a moment, Mark thought she might brush him off, return to her usual composed self. But instead, she turned to him, her eyes soft and searching. "I never thought I'd get here," she whispered. "I never thought I'd let someone in." Mark's heart clenched. He had seen the walls Eleanor had built, and he understood why they were there. She had been burned before, probably more times than she cared to admit. But now, standing before her, he saw the person she had always hidden from the world, the person who longed for connection, for love, just like him. "You don't have to be afraid of that," Mark said gently. He took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm here, Eleanor. And I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a tear glisten in her eye. It was a single tear, but it spoke volumes. She wasn't the cold, untouchable woman she had always portrayed herself to be. She was someone who had been searching for something real, something she could trust. And Mark realized that, perhaps, they were both searching for the same thing. Slowly, Eleanor stepped forward, closing the space between them. For a moment, they just stood there, face to face, the world around them forgotten. Then, without another word, Eleanor reached out and gently touched Mark's cheek. The gesture was tender, intimate, and Mark could feel the warmth of it seep into his chest. The walls that had kept them apart were beginning to crumble. Eleanor had let down her guard, and Mark could see the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. Without thinking, he leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss that was filled with the promise of something more. It wasn't grand, it wasn't a dramatic declaration, but it was everything they needed. The kiss was a symbol, a quiet acknowledgement that they were no longer just living in an arrangement. They were beginning to build something real. As they pulled away, Eleanor rested her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the stillness of the night. "I think I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, his heart racing in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was to be with her, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly living his own life, one that was filled with possibility. As the days went on, Mark and Eleanor's connection deepened in a way neither of them expected. What had started as a simple agreement, a business deal, was now becoming something far more complex. They had begun to shed the roles they had played, the husband and wife in name only, and were slowly becoming something real, partners. But even as they grew closer, the weight of their initial arrangement still hung over them like a shadow, and they both knew that sooner or later, the truth would have to be faced. It was late one evening when the tension finally came to a head. Mark was in the study, flipping through some papers, when Eleanor walked in. There was a noticeable change in her demeanor. Her usual composure seemed to crack, and she looked at him with a certain heaviness in her eyes. "We need to talk," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Mark stood up from the desk, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Eleanor hesitated, looking out the window before turning back to face him. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us," she began. "When we first entered into this arrangement, it was all so clear. There were no emotions involved, no complications. But now, things have changed." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had been feeling it too, that undeniable shift, the feelings that had developed between them despite their best efforts to remain detached. "I know," he replied, his voice a mix of relief and apprehension. "I've been feeling it too. But Eleanor, we've been through so much together already. Maybe it's time we stop pretending." Eleanor sighed and walked over to the fireplace, running her fingers over the mantel as if gathering her thoughts. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I never expected to feel this way, Mark. You've changed everything for me. But I don't know if I'm ready for this, for us." Her words stung, and Mark could feel the knot in his chest tighten. He had known from the beginning that their relationship was complicated, but hearing Eleanor say those words made him realize just how much she was still holding back. "I don't want to rush you," Mark said quietly, stepping toward her. "But we can't keep pretending that nothing's changed. I care about you, Eleanor. And I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this could go." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression a mixture of conflict and vulnerability. "I care about you too, Mark," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "But this is all so new. I'm not sure I can trust this, trust us." The uncertainty in her voice broke Mark's heart. He had never seen her like this, vulnerable, unsure, not the confident, commanding woman who had seemed invincible. In that moment, he realized just how much they both had to lose. But he also realized that if they didn't take the chance now, they might never know what could have been. "I understand," he said softly. "And I'm not asking you to jump into anything. But I believe in what we have, Eleanor. I believe in us." The silence that followed felt heavier than ever. Neither of them spoke, but the words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Slowly, Eleanor walked over to him, her steps hesitant but determined. She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. "Let's take this one step at a time," she said, her voice softer now, filled with a new resolve. Mark nodded, feeling a rush of emotions flood through him. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they both acknowledged what was between them, and now, it was finally happening. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all still there, but for the first time, it didn't matter. They were ready to face it together. As they stood there, holding hands, Mark realized that this was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And in that moment, that was enough. The days that followed felt different for both Mark and Eleanor. The distance between them had lessened, but there was still an underlying tension, a lingering question of whether they could truly let go of the past and embrace something new. It wasn't an easy journey for either of them. Eleanor, once so strong and in control, now found herself vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in years. She had never allowed herself to depend on anyone, let alone trust someone with her heart. And yet, Mark's quiet strength, his patience, and the way he made her feel seen, truly seen, was something she hadn't anticipated. It was terrifying. But she had to admit, it was also something she had wanted for so long. Mark, on the other hand, was learning to let go of the burden of his past. The weight of his father's debts had been an anchor around his neck for so long, but now, with Eleanor by his side, he could begin to imagine a future that wasn't defined by struggle and survival. He hadn't expected this kind of connection when he first agreed to the arrangement. All he had wanted was a way out, a way to protect his family. But now, he couldn't ignore the truth: cared for Eleanor deeply. He wasn't sure what it meant, or where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't walk away. The realization came to him slowly, but it was undeniable. One night, after a particularly long day filled with meetings, Eleanor invited Mark to join her in the library. It was quiet there, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. Eleanor was sitting by the window, a book in her lap, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. Mark stood by the door for a moment, watching her, his heart heavy with something he couldn't name. He had learned so much about her in the past weeks, but there was still so much she kept locked away. He wondered if she would ever let him in completely. He walked over to her, his footsteps light on the soft carpet. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly, taking a seat beside her. Eleanor looked up, her gaze meeting his, but she didn't immediately speak. "I was just thinking," she said after a moment. "About everything. About us." Mark waited, his heart racing. He didn't want to pressure her, but he needed to know where they stood. "And what are you thinking?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the book in her lap. I think I've spent so much of my life building walls," she said quietly. "I've kept people at arm's length, not letting anyone get close. I thought that if I kept control, if I kept everything perfect, I would be safe. But now, I'm not so sure. You've made me question everything." Mark's heart clenched at her words. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear that still held her back. He knew how hard it was for her to open up, to let someone see the parts of her that she had kept hidden for so long. But he wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not asking you to change overnight, Eleanor," Mark said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his face. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "I want to believe in us." Mark reached out, taking her hand in his, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said quietly. "We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to rush anything. But I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." The words settled between them like a promise. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping gesture. But in that moment, both of them knew they had taken a step towards something real. The future was uncertain, and they both still had their doubts, but for the first time, they were facing it together. The walls they had built around themselves were still there, but they were beginning to crumble, one small step at a time. Mark wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but he knew that, for the first time in a long time, he was living his own life. And with Eleanor by his side, maybe, just maybe, they could build something lasting together. As the weeks turned into months, Mark and Eleanor found themselves navigating the delicate balance between the contract they had signed and the undeniable bond that had formed between them. What had once been a cold and calculated arrangement had become something far deeper, more meaningful. They had both changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. Mark had let go of the weight of his past, his father's debts, the fear of failure, and had started to embrace the future. And Eleanor, the woman who had once built walls around herself, had slowly begun to let those walls come down. But despite their growing connection, the question still lingered in the back of both their minds: what would happen when the year was up? Would they return to their separate lives, as they had once agreed? Or had they built something that was strong enough to survive beyond the terms of the contract? They had spent so much time focused on surviving that neither of them had truly allowed themselves to think about the future. It was a sunny afternoon when Eleanor finally spoke the words that had been on both their minds for weeks. They were sitting in the garden, enjoying the warmth of the sun, when she turned to Mark, her expression more serious than usual. "Mark, the year is almost over," she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. Mark's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming but unsure of how to approach it. "I know," he replied softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I don't want to go back to how things were. I don't want to go back to being the man I was before." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time, Mark saw the woman he had come to love truly open up. "I don't either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared. What if we can't make this work when everything else is taken away? What if it's just the contract that held us together all along?" Mark reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "We've made it this far, haven't we?" he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "We've already built something real. Something worth fighting for. And I believe in us. I believe in what we have, not because of a contract, but because of what we've built together." There was a long silence as Eleanor processed his words. Mark could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, but he also saw something else: hope. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't just holding on to her fears. She was considering the possibility of a future beyond the contract, a future with Mark. Slowly, Eleanor squeezed his hand, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. "Maybe we can make it work," she whispered. "Maybe we can build a life that's truly ours." Mark's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and joy. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. The walls that had once divided them had crumbled, piece by piece, until only trust and love remained. And as they sat there, hand in hand, Mark realized that this was what he had been searching for all along: a love that wasn't born out of necessity, but out of choice. A love that was real. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, they didn't need to. What mattered was that they were ready to face it together. Mark leaned in and kissed her gently, his heart full of hope for the future. It wasn't the perfect ending to a story. They had no fairy tale and no promises that everything would be easy. But it was their story, one that had been written in the quiet moments, the shared laughter, and the unspoken understanding between them. And for Mark and Eleanor, that was enough.